All right, so you've got a ton of signaler theory questions just piling up, and you need answers.
Yeah, and you need them fast.
Exactly like yesterday.
Yeah.
Think of this deep dive as your, like, a fast track to safe lifting practices.
We're going to break it all down for you.
Yeah. So
Make it simple so you can really nail those signaler challenges.
with confidence, right? So let's pretend you're a brand new slinger signaler. You're stepping onto a job site for the very first time. What's the first thing you need to know?
Communication, that's the foundation. It's the bedrock of safe lifting.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Before anything else, you need to make sure you've got a clear line of communication with the crane operator.
Okay.
That means making sure that audible alarm's working and that the operator can actually see you on site and tell that it's you.
Yeah, that's a good point about standing out. I bet it's easy to get lost in the crowd.
Oh, totally. You need to be recognizable as the signaler.
Okay.
Right? Distinct PPE is critical.
Oh, okay.
Bright vest, special hard hat that's marked anything that's going to make you stand out from the rest of the crew.
Makes sense. Now, let's say you're ready to signal a lift. The source material mentions this pick and carry. What's the golden rule if you lose sight of the crane operator during a pick and carry?
Everything stops immediately. No exceptions.
Ah, okay.
Operator has to stop the machine the moment visual contact is lost.
Got it.
It's too dangerous to continue without that line of sight.
Yeah, safety first, always. So you're the eyes and ears on the ground guiding the crane, but before you start signaling, you need to make sure you know what you're working with.
Right? Yeah, that's right. Understanding the load is critical, and that starts with figuring out its center of gravity.
Okay, so center of gravity, why is that so important?
Think of it as the balancing point. If you don't take that into account properly, that load could swing all over the place during the lift.
Oh, yeah.
And that's dangerous.
That makes sense. How do you even figure out where that center of gravity is, especially if you're dealing with a weird shape?
So if it's perfectly symmetrical like a box, the center of gravity is right in the middle.
Okay.
But if the weight isn't distributed evenly, the center of gravity is going to shift towards the heavier end.
Oh, okay.
It takes practice to be able to judge it accurately.
Like trying to balance a seesaw.
Yeah.
You got to know where to put that weight to keep it stable.
Exactly. And just like a seesaw, if the weight shifts, all of a sudden things can go wrong in a hurry.
Yeah, so you've assessed your load. You've got a sense of its center of gravity.
Yeah.
Now it's time to pick the right lifting accessories. So the source material mentions different types of slings.
Ooh.
What are the key things to remember when selecting the right sling for the job?
First, you need to think about how heavy that load is.
Okay.
Choose a sling that has a safe working load that's greater than that weight.
You wouldn't want it to snap.
Yeah, exactly. Then you need to consider the shape of the load.
Okay.
And what it's made of, something delicate, might need a webbing sling to stop it from getting damaged, while something really heavy and awkward, you might need a chain sling.
So it's about matching the sling to the job, right?
Yeah.
And what about those multi-leg chain slings? I remember reading something about a 45-degree rule.
Oh, yeah. With those, it's super important that each leg is carrying the same amount of weight.
Okay.
And they need to hang at an angle that's within 45 degrees of vertical to keep that safe working load.
Why 45 degrees?
Think about it this way. If the legs are spread out too far, it puts more stress on them.
Uh-huh.
It's like trying to hold something heavy with your arms stretched way out. It's much harder than holding it in close to your body.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it. I never thought about it like that. And I remember the source material said if you're using a webbing sling with a choke hitch, the amount you're allowed to lift actually decreases.
Right. That's because some types of hitches and slings can lower the safe working load.
Okay.
It's always important to check those things carefully.
Okay, so you figured out your sling situation. What's next?
Well, before you even think about picking up that load, you need to take a look around you and see what hazards are nearby. That's where the risk assessment comes in.
Risk assessment. It's all about finding those problems before they actually become problems.
That's it. And it's especially important for slinger signalers because you're the one who's controlling the lift, and your actions are going to directly affect everyone's safety.
Yeah, no pressure.
So what kind of hazards are we talking about?
Give us 5 examples of things you really got to be aware of before you even think about lifting anything.
The first one is people. You need to make sure everyone's out of the way before you start.
Okay.
Then there are the buildings and structures. You need to be thinking about how far that load could swing and make sure it's not going to hit anything.
Oh, yeah.
Then there's stuff like fire hydrants and utilities that you don't want to run into.
Okay.
And power lines, you always got to be watching out for power lines.
It's 4. What's the 5th?
Excavation trenches, lifting near an open trench is a whole other level of careful.
Why is that?
Because the ground around the edge of the trench could be really unstable. If the machine gets too close, The ground could collapse, and that machine could fall right in.
That is not a good thought.
No, it's not. So, how do you figure out how far away you need to stay when working near a trench?
Yeah. How do you know?
The rule of thumb is double the depth.
Okay.
So if the trench is 2 meters deep, you need to stay at least 4 meters away from the edge.
Double the depth. Got it. That's easy to remember. What about after the lift? What are some tips for storing those lifting accessories?
The best way to store them is to keep them off the ground and make sure they're dry.
Why off the ground? Why not just leave them on the ground?
If you leave them on the ground, they could get damaged by moisture or dirt
Oh.
or even vehicles driving over them.
Wow.
All of that can weaken the sling and make it unsafe.
So it's about keeping them clean and protected to make sure they last.
Yeah, and it's also really important to inspect them regularly.
Speaking of inspections, let's say you're doing your regular check and you think maybe a sling was overloaded on a previous lift.
You can't take any chances if you suspect it's been overloaded. Take it out of service right away.
Oh.
No exceptions.
Wow.
It needs to be properly inspected by someone who knows what they're doing before it can be used again.
Better safe than sorry. Right? And what are the two most important things to keep in mind when you're doing those regular inspections?
Always check the manufacturer's recommendations for the specific inspection guidelines, and always wear gloves to protect your hands.
Gloves check. We've covered communication, understanding the load, picking the right slings, risk assessment, storage, and inspection. It feels like we've barely scratched the surface.
We have, but these are the foundations.
Okay.
Once you've got a good grip on these principles, you're well on your way to becoming a competent slinger signaler.
A confident slinger signaler.
That's right. Ready to dive into some more specific scenarios?
Oh, yeah. I'm feeling more confident already, but I know there's always more to learn.
Always. All right, so let's say you're helping to fit a fly job to a crane. What's the key thing to remember?
Well, a fly job extends the crane's reach, right? So I'm guessing there's a bigger chance of things going wrong, like becoming unstable or overloading it if it's not fitted correctly.
Exactly. You got to follow the manufacturer's instructions precisely every single step.
Okay.
Any little deviation could cause accidents, damage to the equipment.
Like what kind of damage?
Well, one concern is deflection. The fly job changes how the crane lifts things, making it more likely to bend under the weight.
I see. So that bending could affect the whole operation, make it less stable.
Exactly. And then there's the change in radius. Adding a fly job makes the crane reach further,
Okay.
which means you got to be extra careful moving the load and you need to adjust your calculations.
So it's like adding another lever to a seesaw. More potential for movement, but also more potential for things to go wrong.
You got it. Now let's shift gears. Imagine you're moving a super long load across the site. What makes that so tricky?
Well, I can imagine those long loads swinging around, hitting buildings, or even people.
Controlling that movement is key before you even start signaling you need to take a bunch of precautions.
Like what?
First, you got to establish a safe spot for yourself where you can stand clear of the load's path in case something happens.
Okay, so like your escape route.
Exactly. Then double check those slings, make sure they're really secure.
Uh-huh.
A loose sling on a long load would be a disaster.
Yeah, that's for sure. What else?
Make sure the path is clear.
Okay.
No obstructions, no people, no equipment in the way.
So like a safe corridor.
Right. And finally, get that landing site ready.
Okay.
Make sure it's clear and safe to receive that load.
So planning, preparation, communication, all working together now. Let's zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture. What are the legal and environmental consequences of not following the rules as a slinger signaler?
Well, ignoring the rules isn't just a bad idea. It can actually be illegal.
Okay.
And the consequences can be serious, like fines or even jail time.
Wow, that really emphasizes how important it is to follow the rules. So it's not just about safety, it's about being legally responsible. And what about the environment? How can slinger signalers make sure they're minimizing their environmental impact?
There are a few things you can do work efficiently to reduce fuel and energy use. Plan your lifts ahead of time to cut down on wasted movement and dispose of waste materials properly following the rules.
So it's about being aware of our actions and how they affect the environment, even in a job that doesn't seem directly related to environmental issues. Speaking of being aware, let's go back to the weight of the load. We know it's super important to choose slings with the right, safe working load. But what are all the things that go into that total weight that we need to think about?
You're right. It's not just the weight of the object you're lifting. You also got to factor in the weight of the slings, the shackles, and all the other lifting accessories,
Okay.
and even the weight of the hook block itself.
Oh, I see. So it all adds up, and it's easy to forget about some of those things if you're not careful.
Right. And speaking of things that can affect a lift, we can't forget about the weather.
Oh, yeah, the weather.
Yeah.
Let's talk about rain. How does a rainy day change the game for a Slinger signaler?
Rain adds a whole bunch of challenges.
Okay.
First off, it makes it harder to see,
Uh-huh.
which makes it harder for the slinger signaler and the crane operator to communicate and spot potential hazards.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like driving in fog, everything is harder to see, and you got to be extra careful. What else?
Rain can actually make the loads heavier. Think about bricks, for example. They soak up the water, which adds to the total weight.
Oh, wow. So a load that was safe on a dry day might be too heavy on a rainy day.
That's right. And then there's slippery surfaces. Rain can make loads slip out of the slings, and it can make it harder for the lifting equipment to get a grip.
So lots of potential problems if you're not careful.
Definitely, rain also slows things down in general. Loading and unloading takes longer because you have to be more careful.
Like everything's moving in slow motion.
Yeah. So if rain is in the forecast, be prepared for a slower, more challenging day. Now let's talk about those extra long sling legs. What's a crucial thing to think about in that situation?
Well, those long legs are going to be hanging down pretty far, so I'm guessing you need to make sure they don't drag on the ground or get caught on anything.
Exactly. You gotta make sure there's enough clearance between the bottom of the sling legs and the ground, especially when you're moving the load around.
Right, because if those legs get snagged on something, it could pull the whole load over or make it unstable.
Exactly. Speaking of moving around, let's talk about communication and coordination. Say you're guiding a mobile lifting machine to a new spot for a new lift. What's the most important thing to communicate before that machine starts moving? Before that machine even budges an inch, the marshaller or signaler has to confirm with the operator that the machine's ready for the new lift.
Okay, so it's not just about telling the machine where to go, it's about making sure it's set up correctly for the new lift.
Exactly. What kind of things are we checking? Things like making sure that outriggers are deployed if they're needed, that the counterweight is in the right position, any adjustments specific to the new lift.
Like a pre-flight checklist for the machine.
You got it. Now let's get back to the wind. We know it can change throughout the day, so what do you have to do to keep things safe when the wind picks up? Wind can turn a routine lift into something really dangerous, especially if you've got a load with a big surface area.
Right, because the wind pushes against that surface area like a sail.
Exactly. So when it's windy, you got to be extra careful. You might need to change the plan, like slowing down the lift or even postponing it if the wind gets too strong.
So be flexible. Adapt to the conditions. Safety comes first. Now let's refresh our memory on radius in lifting. Where is that radius measured from when we're talking about cranes?
It's measured from the center of the slewing ring.
Okay.
That's the part that lets the crane rotate to the center of the hook.
So basically it's the crane's maximum reach from its pivot point.
That's it, understanding that radius is crucial for planning safe lifts and making sure you have enough clearance.
It's like an invisible circle around the crane. It's operational zone now, back to those pick and carry duties. Why is turning even a little bit with a suspended load such a big deal?
Turning adds a whole new level of complexity. It changes the forces acting on the load.
Okay.
Even a small turn can shift the center of gravity, making the whole thing unstable.
It's like walking a tightrope with a weight in your hand. Any little movement changes your balance.
That's a perfect analogy. If the center of gravity moves too far outside the machine's support, it could tip over sideways.
Not good.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the work at height regulations. Those might not seem related to lifting, but can you give us some examples of how they would apply to what we do?
You're right. It might not be obvious at first, but those regulations apply anytime there's a risk of falling, even if it's not very high.
So it's not just about working on rooftops.
Right. In lifting operations, you might need to climb up on a load to attach slings
Okay.
or to take them off after the lift. Even if it's not that high, those regulations still apply.
It's a good reminder that safety rules often cover more than we think. Now, let's go back to communication. We've talked about being clear, but let's talk about using radios. What are some things that can mess with those radio signals during a lift?
Relying on radios adds another layer of complexity. You need to be aware of things that can interfere with the signals.
Like what?
One common problem is buildings.
Oh, okay.
If there are lots of buildings around, they can block the radio waves.
Makes sense. What else?
Weak batteries mean weak signals.
So always start the day with fully charged batteries.
Yeah, and maybe even have some spares just in case. And the distance between you and the crane operator can also affect the signal.
Yeah.
The further apart you are, the weaker the signal.
So on a big site, you might need more powerful radios.
Right. And of course, the weather can affect the signal too.
Oh, yeah.
Heavy rain or storms can cause interference or even drop the signal completely.
So Mother Nature can mess with our communication too. Let's go back to wind and how it affects loads with large surface areas. We know those loads are more affected by the wind, but can you explain why?
It's all about surface area and how the wind pushes on things. A load with a big flat surface acts like a sail, catching the wind and making the load swing around.
Like holding a big sheet of plywood on a windy day can pull you right over.
Exactly. The bigger the surface area, the stronger the force from the wind, and that's why those types of loads need extra care, especially in windy conditions.
So it's not just the weight of the load, it's also about its shape and size and how those things interact with the wind. Let's talk about having a plan, specifically a method statement or lift plan.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of that document and how does the Slinger signaler use it?
That document is like a blueprint for the whole lifting operation.
Yeah.
It outlines all the steps, the equipment, the hazards, and how to control them. It's a really detailed document that guides the whole process and makes sure the lift is safe and successful.
So it's not just about showing up and doing whatever you want. There's a lot of planning involved.
Absolutely. And the Slinger signaler is a key part of that plan. You're not just following orders. You're actively making sure the lift happens the way it's supposed to.
So what does that look like in practice?
First, you need to understand the plan completely.
Okay.
Know all the steps, the order of events, the communication protocols, and all the safety precautions.
Like studying for a test.
That's it. And then during the lift, you're the one making sure the plan is followed correctly. You're monitoring everything, communicating with the crane operator, and making sure everything goes as planned.
So knowledge, communication, and vigilance all working together to keep things safe and efficient. Now, let's go back to the wind one last time. Can you sum up 3 ways that wind speed can affect a lift?
Of course, first, wind can make loads swing, especially those with big surface areas.
Okay.
Second, it can affect how fast the crane can rotate. And third, strong winds can push the load outside the crane's safe working radius.
Okay, so the wind can affect the load of the crane and the overall safety of the whole operation. Let's move on to site inductions. What are some key areas that a good site induction should cover to make sure everyone is on the same page about safety?
A good site induction should cover a bunch of topics to make sure workers know about the site's layout, the safety procedures, and what to do in an emergency.
Like, what are the essential things?
It should cover how to get in and out of the site safely, how to report accidents and near misses,
Okay.
where the restrooms, break areas, and first aid stations are, what to do in an emergency, like evacuation routes and assembly points, what the safety signs mean, and any site-specific rules or hazards.
So it's about giving workers all the information they need to stay safe on the site.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to lifting operations, specifically traveling with a suspended load across a site. What are some things that both the machine operator and the Slinger signaler need to think about to make sure that journey is safe?
Traveling with a suspended load is a whole other level of complexity. It requires everyone to be extra careful. There are a lot of factors to consider to make sure the movement is safe and controlled.
Look, what's the first thing on the list?
First, we need to make sure that the machine is actually allowed to travel with a suspended load.
Oh,
Not all machines are designed for that or allowed to do it on every site.
so you can't just assume any lifting machine can do it.
Right. Then we need to check that the machine is set up correctly for the load and the type of ground it will be traveling over.
Oh.
This might mean adjusting the outrigger's tire pressure or other settings to make sure it's stable and doesn't tip over.
So adjusting the machine to the job and the environment.
Exactly. We also need to make sure the machine isn't overloaded. This means thinking about not just the weight of the load, but also things like wind resistance or changes in elevation.
So a full assessment of the machine's capabilities.
That's it. Now, let's think about the travel path itself.
Wow.
We need to check for any overhead hazards.
Like power lines or tree branches.
You got it. It's easy to focus on what's on the ground, but we
Yeah.
got to be just as careful about what's above the load.
Scanning up and down to make sure the path is clear. What about the ground itself?
The ground needs to be strong enough to support the weight of the machine and the load.
Okay.
Soft ground, uneven terrain, or obstacles could all make the machine unstable.
So we're looking for solid ground.
Exactly. And one more thing, the Slinger signaler needs to make sure they have enough help if the load is really big or complicated.
Okay.
They might need extra people to help guide and control the load to make sure it doesn't swing too much or hit anything.
Teamwork is essential, especially when things get tricky now. What happens if the Slinger signaler has to use new lifting accessories, something they've never seen before? What do the rules say about that?
The regulations like LOLAIR 98 are really clear on this point. They say that training is the most important thing.
Okay.
If you're not familiar with a specific lifting accessory, you have to get the proper training information and instructions on how to use it safely.
So it's not just about knowing how slings work in general. It's about knowing the specifics of each type of sling.
Exactly. A chain sling is different from a webbing sling, and a round sling is different from a flat sling. You have to understand those differences to avoid accidents or damage.
So our newbie slinger signaler might need to do some studying or take a training course before using new accessories. Now, let's go back to wearing gloves when inspecting those lifting accessories. Why is that so important?
It might seem like a small thing, but wearing gloves during inspections is really important for safety.
Okay, why is that?
First, it protects your hands from things that might be on the accessories themselves,
Like what?
like sharp edges, burrs, or splinters that could cut you.
Oh, yeah.
Second, gloves stop grease or oil from getting on your skin.
Okay.
This keeps things clean and also prevents those substances from contaminating the load or the accessory itself.
So protecting both the equipment and the load.
That's right. And third, gloves protect your skin from things that might irritate it or cause an allergic reaction.
So it's about safety, hygiene, and health, all in one simple action. Now, let's talk about what employers are responsible for, specifically their obligations when it comes to plant and equipment. What does the Health and Safety at Work say about that?
That act says that employers are responsible for providing plant and equipment that is safe to use.
Okay.
It's not just a suggestion, it's the law.
So they can't just buy the cheapest stuff and hope for the best.
Right, and that responsibility goes beyond just providing the equipment.
Okay.
They also have to maintain that equipment in a safe condition. That means regular inspections, repairs, and replacements to make sure everything is in good working order.
So it's an ongoing commitment, not just a one-time purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's compare contract lift and standard crane hire.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those two?
The main difference is who's in charge in a contract lift. The crane company does pretty much everything.
Okay.
They plan and supervise the whole lifting operation. They provide the crane, the operator, and all the expertise to manage the whole thing.
So if a client doesn't have the knowledge or resources to manage a complex lift, a contract lift makes things easier.
What about standard crane hire?
Yeah. How is that different?
With standard crane hire, the client is more in control.
Okay.
They usually provide the lift plan, and the crane and operator follow the client's instructions.
So it's more hands-on for clients who know what they're doing and want to be in charge.
Exactly. It's more of a team effort where the client and the crane company work together. Now, let's go back to estimating the weight of a load that might seem simple, but it's actually pretty complicated, right? You're right. Getting the weight right is super important for choosing the right equipment and keeping everyone safe.
So what information do we need to make a good estimate?
We need to know a few things first. The volume of the load.
Okay.
That means measuring its length, width, and height.
Like figuring out the volume of a box.
Right. Then we need to know the density of the material.
Okay.
A cubic meter of steel weighs way more than a cubic meter of wood.
So different materials have different densities.
Exactly. And we need to factor that into our calculation. And finally, we need to know if the load is hollow or solid.
Okay.
A hollow object weighs less than a solid object of the same size.
So we're looking at the inside of the load, not just the outside. Let's get back to those quick hitch couplers we talked about. Why it's important to tilt them down when attaching lifting accessories.
Yeah.
Can you remind us of the two main reasons for that?
Sure. Tilting the coupler down does two main things.
Okay, what's the first one?
It stops the lifting accessory from getting caught on the coupler.
Okay.
If the accessory is tilted up, it could hit the coupler when the excavator arm moves.
Oh, I see.
That could damage the accessory, the coupler, or both.
So it's about giving the accessory a clear path.
Right. What's the second reason?
Yeah.
It prevents the accessory from bending. If it's tilted up, it might be forced to bend in a weird way when the excavator arm moves.
So making sure the accessory hangs naturally.
Exactly. Now imagine during a lifting operation, something can't be done the way it says in the lift plan. What's the first thing you should do?
Well, it sounds like there's a problem. So I'd say stop everything immediately. Don't keep going if things aren't going according to plan.
You got it safety first. The moment you see something that doesn't match the lift plan, stop the operation. No exceptions.
Okay, so we've stopped. What happens next? Who decides what to do?
Only the appointed person, the person in charge of the whole lifting operation, can decide.
So nobody can just make changes on their own.
That's right. Any changes have to be approved by the appointed person.
Okay, so there's a clear chain of command now. Let's talk about overhead power lines. What determines how far away our equipment needs to stay from those lines?
Those distances aren't random. They're calculated based on how much voltage is in the power lines and what they're attached to.
So a high voltage line on a metal pole needs a bigger safe distance than a low voltage line on a wooden pole.
Exactly. The higher the voltage, the greater the risk of arcsing. That's when electricity jumps across a gap.
And that's why we can't just avoid touching the lines. We need to stay away from that whole danger zone.
Exactly. Getting too close can be deadly. Speaking of danger zones, What exactly is the danger zone during a lifting operation? The danger zone is anywhere that the load or the lifting equipment could move during the operation.
Okay.
This includes the area we talked about earlier, the working radius of the lifting equipment, and the area where the boom or jub can swing or travel.
So it's constantly changing as the equipment moves and the load is being moved around.
Exactly, and you got to keep everyone out of that zone during the whole lift.
Okay.
That means setting up clear boundaries, using barriers if you need to, and making sure everyone knows the risks.
It's like creating a bubble around the lifting operation to keep people safe. Now, what about rated lifting capacity? What does that mean and who decides what it is?
The rated lifting capacity is the maximum weight a piece of equipment can lift safely.
Okay.
It's not a suggestion. It's a critical safety limit that's set by the manufacturer.
So it's based on the equipment's design and engineering and lots of testing.
Right. You should never exceed that limit. Doing so puts everyone at risk.
It's like overloading a truck. Bad things can happen. Now let's go back to working near an open trench. What about when you're moving a load near a trench, say the trench is 2 meters deep? How far away should you stay?
The same rule applies double the depth.
Okay.
So you should stay at least 4 meters away from the edge.
Whether you're standing still or moving.
That's right. It's all about being careful around those trenches. What could happen if the hook block on a crane slams into the ground?
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
No.
Yeah.
It's not something you want to see happen. It can cause a lot of problems.
Like what?
First, it can damage the lifting equipment itself.
Okay.
The impact can bend or break parts of the hook block or the hoist.
Like dropping a tool.
Yeah, it might still work, but it won't be as safe or reliable. It can also cause the hoist rope to get tangled up.
Okay.
That weakens the rope and makes it more likely to break later on.
So it's like creating a weak spot in the rope.
Exactly, and it can also knock the rope out of alignment on the pulleys, which causes friction and wear and tear on the whole system.
So, not a good thing at all. Now, how does the length of the rope affect how the load moves on a crane? Specifically, how does it affect the swing?
The length of the rope makes a big difference.
Yep.
The longer the rope, the slower and smoother the load will swing.
It's like pushing a kid on a swing. A longer swing is slower and gentler. A shorter swing is faster and jerkier.
That's a great way to think about it. That's why it's important to choose the right rope length for the job and the area you're working in.
Because a short rope could make the load swing out of control and hit things.
Right. What about those markings on lifting accessories? What does the SWL stamp mean, and what should you do if you see an accessory without that marking?
The SWL stands for Safe Working Load. It's the maximum weight the accessory can handle safely.
Okay.
It's a really important safety limit. If you see an accessory without an SWL marking, that's a big problem.
So it's like driving a car without a speedometer.
Yeah, you have no idea how much weight you can safely lift. That accessory should be taken out of service immediately. Wow. Okay, so always be on the lookout for that marking. Now, what about spreader beams? When would you use one of those?
Spreader beams are made for lifting long loads safely and efficiently.
Okay. Why are they good for long loads?
They spread the weight of the load out over multiple points, which reduces the stress on individual slings and makes the whole operation more stable.
Like using multiple supports to hold up a bridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for those long, awkward loads, a spreader beam is often the best and safest choice. Now, let's talk about exclusion zones. We know those are important for keeping lifting operations separate from other work, but what are some things that can make an exclusion zone less effective? Exclusion zones only work if people follow the rules. If people don't respect the boundaries, or if the boundaries aren't clear, those zones are useless.
So it's not just about drawing lines on the ground. It's about making sure everyone understands and follows the rules. What are some common mistakes that can make an exclusion zone less safe?
One big problem is vehicles or equipment moving through the zone without permission. You set up a nice clear zone, and then somebody decides to take a shortcut with a forklift.
Oh yeah, that's not good.
Not good at all. Another issue is not having enough people to control the movement of vehicles and people within the zone.
So you need enough people to monitor the zone and enforce the boundaries.
Exactly. And then there's the problem of missing signs.
Those signs that show where the exclusion zone is.
Right, those signs disappear. It's like taking the warning labels off dangerous chemicals. People might wander into the zone without even realizing it's dangerous.
So those signs are important visual reminders that it's a restricted area. Let's talk about the different types of slings we've mentioned: chain slings, webbing slings, and steel wire rope slings. Can you give us a quick summary of the advantages of each type? When would you choose one over the others?
Each type of sling has its own pros and cons, which makes them suitable for different jobs.
Okay, let's start with chain slings. What makes them special?
Chain slings are tough, they can handle rough treatment, and they're less likely to get damaged by sharp edges or rough surfaces.
So they're the heavy-duty option.
That's right. They're durable, reliable, and can take a beating. Webbing slings are different.
Okay, what's good about webbing slings?
Webbing slings are usually lighter and more flexible,
Okay.
which makes them easier to handle. They're also less likely to damage delicate loads.
So if you're lifting something fragile, a webbing sling is the way to go.
Exactly, they're more gentle. What about steel wire rope slings?
Yeah, where do those fit in?
Steel wire rope slings are the strongest of the bunch.
Okay.
They can handle a lot of weight, and they don't stretch much under load.
So for really heavy lifting, steel wire rope is the best.
Right, they're the strongest and most stable option. Let's go back to deflection and how it affects cranes with lighter booms. We know deflection can make the crane's radius bigger, but why is that a problem?
Well, if the boom bends under the weight of the load, it's basically reaching further than it's supposed to, which could cause problems if you're not expecting it.
Exactly, that unexpected change in radius could lead to the crane hitting something or the load swinging into a dangerous area.
So you got to be really careful and adjust the plan to account for that deflection.
That's right. Now imagine you've got two cranes working close to each other and they're operating radii overlap. That sounds pretty risky. What would a lift plan typically say to prevent those two cranes from colliding?
It's like a carefully choreographed dance. They have to move in sync to avoid each other. What are the rules of the dance, so to speak?
The lift plan would probably set limits on how much each crane can rotate,
Okay.
so they stay within their own safe zones.
So it's about creating boundaries and preventing those cranes from swinging into each other. What else?
The plan would also highlight the importance of the crane's supervisor, who's in charge of the whole operation. They would coordinate everything very carefully, making sure the slingers and operators are communicating clearly to avoid any close calls or collisions.
So there's someone in charge who can see the big picture and make sure everything moves safely. Now, let's talk about quick hitch couplers. Again, this time, not just on excavators. Let's say you're attaching lifting accessories to a quick hitch coupler on any machine for lifting. What are the main things to check on that coupler to make sure it's safe for lifting?
When you're inspecting a quick hitch coupler for lifting, there are a few key things to check.
Okay, walk us through those checks.
First, you got to make sure that coupler is actually designed for lifting.
Okay.
Not all of them are, so you can't just assume it's okay.
So it needs to have a specific rating for lifting.
Right. Then check the safe working load of the coupler.
Uh-huh.
That tells you the maximum weight it can handle safely. Next, you got to inspect the part where the accessory attaches to the coupler.
Okay.
Look for any signs of damage wear or anything that looks bent or out of shape.
So a visual inspection looking for problems.
Exactly. Then check the pins that hold the accessory in place.
Okay.
Those pins are vital to prevent the accessory from coming loose during the lift.
So no loose pins.
No loose pins, and finally make sure that quick hitch coupler is tilted down like we talked about earlier.
To prevent the accessory from getting caught or bent.
Exactly. That small detail can make a big difference in terms of safety. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's talk about something that's a bit scary. Mobile lifting equipment overturning. What are some things that could cause that to happen?
Yeah, that's a worst case scenario, but we need to understand the risks.
Mobile lifting equipment overturning is a complicated issue. There's usually not just one cause. It's usually a bunch of things that happen together.
Okay, so what are some common causes?
One of the most common is working on soft ground. If the ground can't support the weight of the machine and the load, it can collapse and the machine could tip over.
Like building a house on sand.
Exactly. Another common cause is working on slopes. Slopes make the machine less stable and more likely to tip over.
So the steeper the slope, the greater the risk.
Right. And then there's the problem of overloading or the load swinging too much. If the load is too heavy or swings out of control, it can pull the machine over.
Like a pendulum that's swinging too wildly.
Exactly. And finally, not having enough counterweight can also cause the machine to tip over.
Because the counterweight is supposed to balance the load.
That's right. If the counterweight isn't set up correctly or isn't heavy enough, the machine can tip forward. So it's like a seesaw that's out of balance. Now, let's talk about a procedure that's often used to make sure a lift can be done safely. The trial lift. When is that usually done, and what are you checking for during that test?
So it's like a practice run to make sure everything is working properly.
That's it. And there are a few important things to check during a trial lift. First, make sure the load is fully supported by the lifting equipment check, that the slings are tight and the load isn't sagging or tilting too much.
Okay, so making sure everything is balanced and stable.
Exactly. Then check that the load itself is secure and won't slip or move during the lift.
So no surprises during the actual lift.
Right. And finally, check the lifting accessories themselves. Make sure they're properly connected to the load and the lifting equipment, and that they're in good condition with no damage or defects.
So a full check of the load, the equipment, and the accessories all working together. We've talked about training and competence for slinger signalers. But aside from the practical skills, why is it beneficial to have a formal qualification or card for this role?
That qualification or card is like a stamp of approval.
Okay.
It shows potential employers that you've had the right training, been assessed by qualified instructors, and proven that you know how to do the job safely.
So it helps you stand out from the crowd and shows that you take safety seriously.
Exactly. It's a valuable credential that can help you get jobs and makes you more credible on site.
It's like a driver's license for lifting operations. It shows you're qualified. What happens if the crane operator swings the load around too fast?
Swinging a load around too quickly can be dangerous. It can make the load swing out further, increasing the crane's radius and potentially putting it in a hazardous area.
So like speeding up a merry-go-round suddenly.
Exactly. That outward swing can cause all sorts of problems if there are obstacles in the way. What else can happen? It can also cause the crane's arm to lag behind the load, which puts stress on the crane and could make it unstable.
So it's not just the load that's affected at one. The crane itself has to work harder to keep up with that sudden movement.
That's right, and that's why smooth, controlled movements are so important. Let's talk about choosing a safe place of refuge within a busy work area where machines are moving and loads are being lifted. How do you pick a spot that's truly safe? What should you consider?
Yeah, that's a good question.
When choosing a safe place, you need to think about accessibility and protection.
Okay, what does accessibility mean?
It means being able to get to your safe spot quickly and easily if you need to get out of the area.
So no blocked pathways or locked doors.
Exactly. You need a clear path to your safe zone. And what about protection?
Yeah.
Your safe place should protect you from anything dangerous happening in the area. It could be a designated area inside a building, a marked zone behind a barrier, or even having someone watch out for you.
So a spot that's easy to reach and keeps you safe from harm? What if you're inspecting listing accessories and you find damage? What should you do?
That's a serious issue. You need to act quickly and decisively.
Okay, what's the first step?
Tell the crane supervisor or the appointed person immediately.
Okay, so report the damage right away.
Yes. And then take that damaged accessory out of service right away and label it so no one else tries to use it.
So it needs to be quarantined until it's fixed.
Exactly. Let's go back to chain slings and the angle of the legs.
Sure.
Why is it so important to keep those legs pretty straight? What happens if they're spread out too far?
Yeah, why does that matter?
The angle of the legs changes how much weight the sling can handle safely.
Oh, really? So the way the sling is set up changes its strength.
That's right. The legs should ideally be no more than 90 degrees apart. If that angle gets bigger, the sling can't lift as much weight safely.
So the wider the angle, the weaker the sling.
Exactly. It's like trying to lift something heavy with your arms stretched way out. You're not as strong. The same is true for chain slings, so keep those legs fairly straight to make sure the sling can do its job safely. We've talked about the Health and Safety at Work Act, but what are some of the main things that every employee has to do under that act? That act says that everyone is responsible for safety, not just the employer.
Okay.
It's a team effort. So what are some of the specific duties that employees have?
Yes. What do we have to do?
First, you have to take care of your own health and safety and the safety of others around you.
So be responsible and think about how your actions affect others.
Exactly. You also have to cooperate with your employer to meet their health and safety requirements.
Yeah.
That means following rules, wearing PPE, and reporting any hazards you see, and you can't mess with or misuse anything that's provided for safety.
So no messing around with safety equipment.
Right. It's about respecting the safety measures and using them properly. When you're moving a suspended load, where should that load be in relation to the ground?
Yeah. What's the best position for the load?
Keep it as close to the ground as you can.
Okay, why is that so important?
The higher the load, the more likely it is to swing and become unstable. It's like a pendulum. The higher it is, the more it swings. Keeping it close to the ground makes it easier to control and reduces the risk of it hitting anything.
Like carrying a tray full of drinks. You keep it close to your body to keep it stable.
Exactly. It's all about stability and control. What checks do you need to make before lowering a load into a trench?
Yeah, what do you have to look out for?
Lowering a load into a trench requires extra care. There are a few things to check before you start.
Okay, what's first?
First, make sure there's nobody and nothing in the trench that could be hit by the load.
So clear the trench before you lower anything in.
Exactly, and make sure the walls of the trench are properly supported to prevent them from collapsing.
Because the weight of the load could make the walls cave in.
That's right. You have to think about the safety of the people inside the trench and the strength of the trench itself. We've talked about moving and swinging loads. What are some of the key things a slinger signaler needs to think about when guiding those movements? When you're guiding those movements, you have to think about time and distance.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
It's all about being able to stop the load safely. You need to think about obstacles, changes in the ground, and other things that might make you have to stop the operation.
So have enough space and time to react.
Exactly. You need to think ahead and make sure you have enough room and time to stop the load safely. We've talked about the risks of working on slopes, but how exactly does a slope affect the stability of the equipment?
Yeah. How does that work?
Working on a slope changes the way the weight is distributed and makes the machine less stable.
Like trying to balance on one leg.
Exactly, and when you lift a load on a slope, it makes things even worse. The load acts like a lever, making the machine even more likely to tip over.
So the steeper the slope and the heavier the load, the more dangerous it is.
That's right. It's a delicate balance, and working on slopes requires a lot of care and planning. Let's define a hazard. What exactly is a hazard in the context of workplace safety?
Yeah, we use that word a lot, but what does it really mean?
Simply put, a hazard is anything that could cause harm.
Okay.
Anything that puts your health, safety, or well-being at risk.
So not just things that are actively dangerous, but anything with the potential to cause an injury or accident.
Exactly. A hazard could be a physical object, a substance, a work process, a condition, or even someone's behavior.
So lots of things can be hazards. What about those polyester webbing slings? They often have different colors and black lines on them. What do those markings mean?
Those markings tell you how much weight the sling can handle safely.
Oh, so you can tell just by looking at it.
Right. Different colors and numbers of black lines mean different weight capacities.
Like a code for sling safety, so you can quickly see the sling's limits. Mobile lifting equipment puts pressure on the ground, especially when carrying heavy loads. What parts of the machine are actually pressing on the ground, and are there ways to reduce that pressure?
The wheels, tracks, and stabilizers are the main parts that touch the ground, and they spread the weight of the machine and the load.
Like the machine is standing on multiple legs.
Exactly. There are a couple of ways to reduce that ground pressure.
Okay, how do you do that?
One way is to make the machine lighter, either by taking off parts that aren't needed or by using a smaller machine for the job.
So using the right tool for the job.
Exactly. The other way is to make the parts that touch the ground bigger. This spreads the weight out over a larger area and reduces the pressure on any one spot.
Like wearing snowshoes?
That's a great analogy. So it's about being aware of that ground pressure and trying to minimize it. What happens if a slinger signaler breaks the rules? What are the consequences? Breaking the rules isn't just a bad idea. It can be illegal and lead to different types of sanctions depending on how serious the violation is.
Okay, so different levels of consequences.
At the lower end, there are verbal and written warnings from employers or supervisors.
So a reminder to follow the rules.
Exactly. For more serious violations, the employer can fire the employee.
So there are consequences for putting people at risk.
Right. And then there are the legal consequences. In really serious cases, individuals can be prosecuted in court.
So the legal system can get involved to enforce safety standards.
Exactly. The penalties can include big fines or even jail time.
Wow. So it's not something to take lightly. Safety is a serious matter. We've talked a lot about safety, but what about the environment? How can slinger signalers work in a way that's better for the environment?
Sustainability is everyone's responsibility, even in a job like this where it might not seem obvious.
Okay, so what can we do?
First, work efficiently. The less time you spend on a task, the less fuel and energy you use.
So plan carefully and minimize wasted movement.
Exactly. Plan your work ahead of time to avoid unnecessary trips.
So less driving around and less fuel used.
Right. And dispose of waste properly. Recycle what you can and follow the rules for hazardous materials.
So it's about respecting the environment and keeping the site clean and sustainable. Well, I think we've covered everything in this deep dive, from communication and load assessment to specialized equipment and environmental responsibility.
It's been a great overview of slinger signaler theory.
And I feel much more confident in my understanding of these important concepts, thanks to you.
I'm glad to hear that. Remember to keep learning Keep asking questions and always try to improve your skills.
I will, and thanks for sharing those source materials. They're a great resource.
You're welcome. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
I will. Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive into the world of slinger signaling. Stay safe out there and keep those loads moving smoothly.